What if I told you that one of the most important stories in Christianity was erased, not by accident, not through forgetfulness, but deliberately silenced over centuries? Imagine for a moment, a woman walking along the shores of the Mediterranean. Her steps are hurried, her gaze vigilant. She carries with her not just memories of a transformative love, but something far more precious, something that powerful institutions would do anything to hide. This woman is Mary Magdalene, and what she protects may have changed the course of Western history. For nearly 2,000 years, we've been taught that Mary Magdalene was just a repentant follower, a redeemed sinner, a secondary figure in the grand narrative of Christianity. But what if this version was only a small fraction of the truth? What if, behind this carefully constructed image, there existed a story of desperate protection, strategic escape, of secrets transmitted in whispers through generations? The question that brings us here today is both disturbing and fascinating. If Mary Magdalene had descendants, who protected them after her death? Who took on the responsibility of guarding not just lives, but a legacy that could challenge the most consolidated power structures in human history? We're not here to create fantasies. We're not going to invent groundless conspiracies. What we'll do in the next several minutes is something far more interesting. We're going to follow the clues left by ancient manuscripts, oral traditions preserved by marginalized communities, symbols hidden in medieval works of art, and archaeological discoveries that shed new light on early Christianity. We're going to investigate communities that were persecuted for centuries. We're going to analyze texts that were considered too dangerous to survive. We're going to walk routes that connect first-century Palestine to medieval France, passing through secret communities that preserved forbidden memories. This isn't just a historical journey, it's an investigation into how truth can be shaped, how narratives can be controlled, and how, despite all efforts, certain stories refuse to disappear completely. They remain alive in traditions, in symbols, in sacred places that still today attract millions of pilgrims without most knowing exactly why. Have you ever wondered why certain churches in France are dedicated to Mary Magdalene? Why specific traditions exist in Romani communities that speak of a protected sacred child? Why some Gospels were excluded from the Bible we know today? The story we're going to explore together stirs fundamental questions about faith, power, and truth. It forces us to question who has the right to decide which stories survive and which are buried? And more importantly, what do we lose when certain voices are silenced? Prepare yourself, because what you're about to discover may change your understanding not just about Mary Magdalene, but about how history is written by the victors, how institutions consolidate their power through narrative control, and how small resistant communities can preserve inconvenient truths through generations. Take a deep breath, open your mind, and let's together unravel one of the most fascinating mysteries of early Christianity. Who protected Mary Magdalene's children after her death? Before we understand who protected her possible descendants, we need to reconstruct who Mary Magdalene really was. And here we encounter the first major problem. The Mary Magdalene we know through popular tradition is very different from the Mary Magdalene who emerges when we study primary historical sources. In the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Mary Magdalene appears at crucial moments. She's present at the crucifixion when most male disciples had fled. She's the first witness of the resurrection. In John 20:17, it's to her that Jesus addresses his first words after rising. She receives the mission to announce the good news to the other disciples. Think about the magnitude of this. In a society where a woman's testimony had limited legal value, the Gospels place Mary Magdalene as the first witness of Christianity's most important event. This isn't an insignificant detail. It's a deliberate narrative choice that reveals her importance in the early Christian community. But here begins the divergence between different traditions. The Roman Catholic Church, for centuries, merged three different characters into one: Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, and the unnamed sinner from Luke 7. This merger, which many scholars consider problematic, created the image of the repentant prostitute that dominated Western imagination. In 1969, the Catholic Church officially separated these three figures, acknowledging the error. But the narrative damage had already been done. For more than 1,000 years, Mary Magdalene had been reduced to a symbol of sexual sin and redemption, obscuring her role as a spiritual leader. When we look at texts that didn't enter the official biblical canon, And here we need to be careful and honest about our sources. We find a very different Mary Magdalene. The Gospel of Mary, dated by some researchers to the 2nd century, presents her as a repository of special teachings. The Gospel of Philip contains passages that some academics interpret as indicating a close relationship between Jesus and Magdalene, although the manuscript is damaged precisely in the most revealing parts. We need to be clear here. These Gnostic texts aren't accepted as historically reliable by all academic currents. Some experts consider them later theological developments, not direct historical records. But they reveal something important. Early Christian communities had very diverse views about Mary Magdalene, and some of these communities saw her as a central figure, not peripheral. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts in 1945 brought these texts to public light after centuries buried in the Egyptian desert. Why were they buried? Because their communities were being persecuted. Because the texts they possessed were considered heretical by consolidated religious authorities. Contemporary academic studies on early Christianity reveal a much more complex mosaic than the unified narrative we know. There were multiple Christian communities with different theologies, different practices, and crucially, different stories about the same characters. Some of these communities gave women leadership roles. We have archaeological evidence of women deacons, of women who led household worship, of women patrons who financially sustained entire communities. Mary Magdalene may have been a prototype or inspiration for these female leaderships. What makes this historically plausible is the 1st century Jewish context. Contrary to what many imagine, there were Jewish women with power and influence. There were biblical precedents of women prophets, judges, leaders. The idea of a woman in a position of spiritual authority wasn't completely foreign in that context. So, who was Mary Magdalene really? The honest answer is, we have fragments. We have texts that agree on some basic points, her presence at crucial moments, her importance in the early community, but diverge dramatically on other aspects. We have traditions that celebrate her as apostle to the apostles. We have others that reduce her to a silent penitent. What we can affirm with certainty, based on the universally accepted canonical texts, is that Mary Magdalene was a crucial witness of Christianity's foundational events and a respected figure in the early community. Everything beyond that enters territory of interpretation, tradition, and yes, informed speculation. But here's the crucial point for our investigation. If Mary Magdalene had descendants, they would be born into a context of Christian diversity, of communities in dispute over authority and interpretation, of growing tensions between different visions of what Christianity should be. And it's exactly in this turbulent context that the protection of any descendant of hers would become a matter of survival. Before we continue this investigative journey, I want to make an invitation. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story resonates with you. Perhaps it's the search for deeper truths. Perhaps it's curiosity about what was left out of the official narrative. Perhaps it's simply fascination with well-grounded historical mysteries. This channel exists for people like you, for those who aren't satisfied with superficial answers, for those who want to investigate, question, learn. We don't offer crazy theories or empty sensationalism. We offer serious research, careful analysis, and respect for both history and different faith traditions. By subscribing, you join a global community of seekers, people from different countries, different backgrounds, different beliefs, but united by a thirst for knowledge. Activate the bell so you don't miss the next steps of this investigation, because what comes next is even more intriguing. Now let's dive into the traditions that were preserved in the shadows of official history. There's a legend that has persisted for centuries in southern France. It speaks of a boat without oars, guided by divine hands, that supposedly arrived on the shores of Provence around 40 AD. Inside it, according to these traditions, were Mary Magdalene, other women followers of Jesus, and a child. This child has a name in oral traditions preserved by Romani communities: Sarah, Sarah la Kali, Sarah the Black. Each year, thousands of pilgrims visit Sainte-Marie de la Mer, a small French coastal town, to honor this mysterious figure. We need to be absolutely clear about the status of these traditions. They aren't proven historical evidence. They're narratives transmitted orally by marginalized communities over centuries, but that doesn't make them irrelevant. In fact, it makes them fascinating objects of historical and anthropological study. Why would Romani communities who were persecuted, enslaved, and massacred throughout European history preserve with such dedication a tradition about Sara? Why would this figure be so central to their spiritual identity? Some researchers studying oral traditions suggest that stories preserved by marginalized communities sometimes contain memories of events that were erased from official history. We're not saying this proves literal descent. We're saying there are layers of meaning in these traditions that deserve serious analysis. The tradition of Mary Magdalene's arrival in France isn't limited to Romani communities. There are medieval texts that mention her presence in Provence. The Golden Legend, a 13th century compilation of saints' lives, dedicates an extensive section to Mary Magdalene and her supposed French journey. Again, medieval texts aren't reliable historical sources about first-century events, but they reveal what people of that period believed, which stories they considered important to preserve, which traditions they valued. There's something more intriguing. The cult of Mary Magdalene in medieval France was extraordinarily strong. Basilicas were erected in her honor. Relics attributed to her became objects of massive pilgrimage. Kings and popes visited these places. Why this particular devotion? Why would Mary Magdalene, among all possible saints, receive such disproportionate attention in specific regions of France? One possibility, suggested by some historians studying popular religiosity, is that these local traditions preserved memories of alternative Christianities that existed before the consolidation of Roman power. Communities that perhaps had different narratives about the foundational events. There are also traditions about the Cathars, a religious movement that flourished in southern France between the 11th and 13th centuries. The Cathars were brutally eliminated by the Albigensian Crusade. But before their destruction, they preserved texts and traditions that Catholic authorities considered heretical. Some scholars who investigated Cathar theology identified elements that seemed to value the sacred feminine in ways uncommon for medieval Christianity. There was speculation about secret traditions related to Mary Magdalene, although direct evidence is scarce because most Cathar texts were destroyed. What can we do with these fragmented traditions? We can't treat them as direct historical proof, but we can recognize that they point to something. Communities that preserved alternative narratives about Christianity's origins, often at the cost of severe persecution. If Mary Magdalene had descendants, they wouldn't just need physical protection, they would need narrative protection. Their stories would need to be preserved in ways that escaped institutional control. And oral traditions in marginalized communities are exactly the type of vehicle that could accomplish this preservation. Think about the logic of this. If you were a member of a persecuted community, how would you preserve sensitive information? You wouldn't write documents that could be confiscated. You would transmit stories orally, encoded in rituals, symbols, annual pilgrimages. The traditions about Sara Lakali work exactly like this. They're performative, realized through annual rituals. They're symbolic, expressed through images, not texts. They're communal, belonging to groups, not individuals. This doesn't prove that Sara was Mary Magdalene's literal daughter, but it demonstrates that traditions about descent existed, were valued, and were preserved despite, or perhaps because of, official repression. There's another fascinating element in these traditions. They frequently emphasize protection. Sara is described as protected. Mary Magdalene is described as a protector. The boat without oars represents divine protection. The entire narrative is structured around the theme of guarding something precious. If these traditions encode real historical memory, and this is a major academic question, they speak of a community that saw itself as a guardian. Guardian of what? Of people, of teachings, of lineage. The traditions don't specify clearly, which may be a deliberate strategy of protection through ambiguity. What makes these traditions particularly interesting is their persistence. They survived centuries of persecution. They survived the Inquisition. They survived the Enlightenment. They survived secular modernity. Even today, communities gather annually to honor Sara Lakali. Stories that persist like this generally have deep roots. They serve important functions for the communities that preserve them. And sometimes, just sometimes, they contain kernels of historical truth, wrapped in layers of symbolism and narrative elaboration. Our task as investigators isn't to blindly accept these traditions, but also isn't to arrogantly dismiss them. It's to examine what they can teach us about how marginalized communities preserve memories, how alternative narratives survive at the margins of official power, and how history is always more complex than official versions suggest. If descendants of Mary Magdalene existed, they wouldn't survive alone. They would need protection networks, communities willing to risk everything to guard a secret considered sacred. Let's examine who could have taken on this role. First, early Christian communities were much more diverse than we imagine. When Paul writes his letters in the 1st century, he's already dealing with divisions, different interpretations, disputes over authority. There wasn't a unified Christianity. There were Christianities, plural. Some of these communities were led or co-led by women. We have textual evidence of this. Paul mentions Phoebe, whom he calls a deacon. He mentions Junia, whom some manuscripts identify as an apostle. He mentions Priscilla, who teaches alongside her husband Aquila. This is important because it reveals that communities where women had spiritual authority existed and were recognized. If Mary Magdalene had descendants, communities with this more egalitarian orientation would be natural protectors. The Gnostics represent a particularly intriguing case. Gnosticism wasn't a monolithic movement. It was a constellation of groups with related but distinct theologies. Many Gnostic groups valued direct knowledge, personal mystical experience, and crucially, had views about the sacred feminine that diverged radically from the Christianity that would become dominant. Gnostic texts frequently present dialogues between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, where she demonstrates superior understanding. In the Gospel of Mary, when disciples are disturbed after Jesus' departure, it's Mary Magdalene who consoles and teaches them. Peter expresses jealousy and disbelief that Jesus would have given special teachings to a woman. This textual conflict may reflect real conflicts between early Christian communities. Communities that valued female leadership versus communities that resisted it. Communities that followed Peter's visions versus communities that followed Mary Magdalene's visions. If there was dispute over authority and interpretation, there was need for protection for those on the losing side when a specific Christianity consolidated political power. The consolidation began seriously with Constantine in the 4th century. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD was a crucial moment. There, bishops gathered under imperial authority began the process of defining orthodoxy. What was in and what was out, which texts were accepted, which practices were legitimate. Groups that didn't conform were progressively marginalized, their texts were confiscated, their leaders were exiled, their communities were dispersed. But marginalization doesn't mean extinction. It means these communities became clandestine. They needed to develop survival strategies. And one of these strategies was preserving traditions orally, not textually. Imagine you're a member of a Gnostic community in the 4th century. Your community preserves traditions about Mary Magdalene that contradict the emerging official narrative. You have manuscripts considered heretical. You know inspections are happening, that texts are being burned. What do? You bury your most precious texts in the desert, as happened at Nag Hammadi. You memorize important teachings. You encode sensitive information in symbols that outsiders wouldn't understand. And if your community protects not just teachings but people, descendants considered carriers of sacred heritage, you intensify these protection strategies even more. There's evidence of protection networks among early Christian communities. Paul's letters mention hospitality systems where traveling Christians were welcomed and protected. This wasn't just courtesy, it was survival necessity in an often hostile empire. These networks could easily be adapted to protect specific individuals considered especially valuable or vulnerable. There are also traditions about female monastic communities that may have served as sanctuaries. Women's monasteries existed from very early periods of Christianity. They offered physical protection, relative autonomy from male ecclesiastical structures, and continuity through generations. Some feminist scholars researching early Christianity suggest that these female spaces preserved alternative traditions precisely because they were partially invisible to official male power. We're not talking about organized conspiracy, but about organic preservation that happens when communities maintain their own stories. The Judeo-Christian communities present another intriguing possibility. These were groups that maintained Jewish practices while following Jesus. They were progressively marginalized as Gentile Christianity dominated by Paul became mainstream. These communities had connections with the Jewish diaspora, networks extending throughout the Mediterranean. If Mary Magdalene, a practicing Jew, had descendants, Judeo-Christian communities would be culturally compatible protectors. What's fascinating about all these possible protection networks is that they're not mutually exclusive. A person or family could be protected sequentially by different groups over generations: Gnostic community in Palestine, Judeo-Christian network in Egypt, female monastery in Asia Minor, marginal community in Gaul. Each movement would be motivated not by central conspiracy, but by local conviction that protecting this person or family was a sacred duty. There are historical precedents for this type of protection in decentralized networks. During Nazi persecutions, Jews were protected by resistance networks that functioned without central coordination. Each link protected and passed forward, often without knowing complete details. If similar protection happened in early Christianity, it would leave exactly the type of trail we see: fragmented traditions in different places, without unified narrative, but with recurring themes of protection, secrecy, and sacred transmission. I want to pause here and ask a question that may reveal something profound. Think about the traditions of your own family, your own community. Are there stories that were passed down orally, generation after generation, that were never written but remain alive? These family and community stories teach us something important. Memory doesn't need official documents to survive. Sometimes the most important memories are those whispered, not proclaimed. Leave in the comments, do you recognize in your own experience this power of oral traditions? Share a tradition from your family or community that was preserved through generations. Let's create here a collective testimony of how memory works outside official channels. And while you reflect on that, let's continue our investigation, now tracing the geographical routes that these protection networks could have used. The first-century Mediterranean was a liquid highway. Commercial, military, and passenger ships constantly crossed between ports established for centuries. If someone needed to move people discreetly from Palestine to the west, maritime routes would offer well-established paths. Let's map possibilities based on historical evidence of movement patterns in the ancient world. From Jerusalem to the Palestinian coast, we have about 80 kilometers. Caesarea Maritima was the main port, built by Herod the Great, and an important commercial center. Joppa, modern Jaffa, was an older port with deep commercial connections. From any of these ports, regular routes went to Alexandria in Egypt, to Antioch in Syria, to Ephesus in Asia Minor, to Corinth in Greece, and eventually to Rome. Alexandria deserves special attention. In the first century, it had the largest Jewish population of any city in the world. It was an extraordinary intellectual center, where Greek philosophy and Jewish thought met and interacted. Philo of Alexandria, a contemporary of Jesus, exemplifies this cultural synthesis. For someone fleeing Palestine, Alexandria would offer anonymity in a massive Jewish population, sophisticated cultural infrastructure, and commercial connections to anywhere in the known world. We know that Christian communities established themselves in Alexandria very early. Tradition associates Mark the Evangelist with founding the Alexandrian Church. Alexandria would become a center of Christian theology, producing thinkers like Origen and Clement. More intriguing, Alexandria was also a center of Christian Gnosticism. Many Gnostic texts were written in Coptic, the language of Egypt. Nag Hammadi, where Gnostic manuscripts were discovered in 1945, is in Upper Egypt. If Gnostic communities valued Mary Magdalene in a special way, and if Alexandria was a hub of both Gnosticism and the Jewish population, the city represents a logical node in any protection network. From Alexandria, well-established maritime routes went west. Crete was a few days' sail away. From Crete, Sicily. From Sicily, the Italian coast. And from Italy, Gaul, modern France, via land or coastal routes. The Palestine, Egypt, Crete, Sicily, Italy. Gaul route isn't speculation. It's a documented commercial path used by merchants for centuries before Christ. Egyptian grain fed Rome. This route had constant traffic. Someone traveling this route could easily blend in with ordinary merchants, pilgrims, or refugees. In the ancient world, population movement was constant for economic, political, and religious reasons. The arrival in southern France, specifically in Provence, makes geographical sense. The French Mediterranean coast had established ports since Greek times. Massilia, modern Marseille, was founded by Greeks in the 6th century BC. Provence had established Jewish populations. There's archaeological evidence of synagogues in several cities of the region already in the 1st century. Jewish diaspora communities maintained connections with each other, creating networks that would facilitate movement and protection. Moreover, southern France was relatively distant from centers of imperial power. Rome obviously dominated, but peripheral areas of the empire had more local autonomy. For someone seeking protection, distance from power centers was a strategic advantage. The traditions about Mary Magdalene in Provence specify concrete locations: Sainte-Marie de la Mer as the arrival point, Saint-Baume as a place of retreat, Saint-Maximin as the burial place. Archaeology can verify some claims but not others. We know that Christianity arrived in Gaul relatively early, although exact dates are debated. We know that Provence had established Christian communities in the 2nd century, possibly earlier. What we can't verify archaeologically is the presence of specific individuals. Archaeology rarely manages to confirm or refute the presence of a specific, non-elite person in a specific location from antiquity, but we can establish plausibility. The roots existed, the community connections existed. The motivation for movement, religious persecution, was real. The destinations had infrastructure to receive refugees. There's biblical precedent for flight from Palestine. The Gospel of Matthew narrates the Holy Family's flight to Egypt when Herod threatened the child Jesus. Jewish families taking refuge in Egypt or other areas of the diaspora was an established pattern. If Mary Magdalene needed to protect children, following established patterns of refuge would be a logical decision. Egypt first, with its enormous Jewish population. Then gradual movement west following commercial and community networks, eventually arriving at peripheral regions of the empire where surveillance would be less. This reconstruction doesn't prove the journey happened, but it demonstrates that it was absolutely viable with the technology, routes, and social networks available in the 1st century. To understand who protected possible descendants of Mary Magdalene, we need to understand why protection would be necessary. And this brings us to the central question: how were narratives about Christianity's origins controlled, edited, and in some cases, completely erased? The process of forming the biblical canon wasn't instantaneous or peaceful. It was long, complex, and frequently political. In the 1st centuries of Christianity, different communities used different collections of texts. Some Gospels that today we consider apocryphal were read regularly in certain churches. Some texts that today are in the New Testament were disputed for centuries. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD is often cited as a defining moment, but we need to be precise about what really happened there. The Council focused primarily on theological questions about the nature of Christ, especially the Arian controversy. It didn't produce an official list of canonical books, although it certainly influenced the process. Canonization was a gradual process that extended over several centuries. Different regions accepted different books at different times. It was only in the 4th century that lists began to stabilize, and even then there were regional variations. Criteria for inclusion included apostolic authorship, real or attributed, widespread use in churches, theological orthodoxy. But orthodoxy was a category under construction. What was orthodox for one community could be heretical for another. Texts excluded from the canon didn't disappear immediately. Some continued being copied and read for centuries. Others were actively suppressed. This suppression intensified as Christianity became the official religion of the empire and gained power to enforce conformity. Among the texts that didn't enter the canon, several present Mary Magdalene prominently. The Gospel of Mary, already mentioned, is a clear example. In it, after the resurrection, disciples are disturbed and frightened. Mary Magdalene rises to comfort them and shares a vision she had. Peter questions how Jesus could have given special teachings to a woman. Levi, probably Matthew, defends Mary, saying that if the Savior considered her worthy, who is Peter to reject her? This text may reflect real tensions between different authorities in the early church. Tensions between Petrine traditions, based on Peter, and traditions that valued Mary Magdalene's leadership. The Gospel of Philip contains even more intriguing passages, although the manuscript is damaged at crucial points. A partially legible passage has been interpreted by some as a reference to Jesus kissing Mary frequently, which generated jealousy in the other disciples. The interpretation of this passage is highly debated. Some academics argue that kiss in Gnostic contexts was a symbol of spiritual transmission, not romantic expression. Others see a reference to a more intimate relationship. The manuscript is so damaged that absolute certainty is impossible. But what's undeniable is that these texts consistently present Mary Magdalene as a figure of spiritual authority, frequently in tension with male disciples, especially Peter. Why were these texts excluded? Official explanations focused on questionable authorship and problematic theology. Critics argue there was also political motivation, consolidating authority in a male hierarchical structure. What happened to communities that valued these texts? Some conformed. Others resisted and were progressively marginalized. Some were violently suppressed. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria, which happened in multiple waves over centuries, eliminated countless texts. We don't know how many alternative gospels, apocryphal acts, lost letters were burned. The discovery of Nag Hammadi in 1945 was revolutionary precisely because it revealed texts that survived only by being buried and forgotten. These manuscripts were hidden by a community that knew it was being persecuted, that their sacred texts would be destroyed if discovered. Imagine the decision to bury your most sacred texts. You know you may never recover them. But you prefer to preserve them hidden in the earth than to see them burned by authorities who consider your beliefs dangerous. This was the reality for non-conforming Christian communities in the 4th and 5th centuries. If these communities preserved texts about Mary Magdalene at risk of persecution, how much more would they protect living people considered carriers of sacred heritage? There's a pattern here. Texts that present Mary Magdalene prominently tend to come from marginalized traditions. Texts that minimize her tend to come from traditions that became dominant. This isn't coincidence. It's the result of selection. Communities with certain types of narratives gained institutional power and could determine which texts would survive officially. But official suppression is never completely effective. Texts survive in clandestine copies. Traditions survive in communities that resist. Memories survive in symbols, rituals, sacred places. What do the silenced manuscripts teach us about protecting descendants? They show that there was real need for protection. Communities that valued alternative memories about Mary Magdalene faced real threats. If they protected texts with such dedication, they would certainly protect people with even more fervor. The manuscripts also reveal protection strategies: hiding, encoding, transmitting secretly. These same strategies would apply to protecting people. And finally, the manuscripts demonstrate that not every story was erased. Fragments survive. Clues remain. Truth, even when suppressed, has an obstinate tendency to resurface. To fully understand why descendants of Mary Magdalene would need protection, we need to examine dramatic changes in women's roles as Christianity evolved from a 1st century Jewish movement to a 4th century imperial religion. Early Christianity, surprisingly for many, had significant female participation. This is documented even in the universally accepted canonical texts. Paul mentions numerous female collaborators. Phoebe is called a deacon of the church in Centuria. Junia is described in some translations as notable among the apostles. Priscilla appears instructing Apollos, an eloquent Christian leader, but initially misinformed. In his letters, Paul establishes that there is neither male nor female in Christ. This phrase, in the context of the 1st century, was radical. It was challenging fundamental social hierarchies of the Greco-Roman world. Archaeological evidence confirms female leadership in some early communities. Sepulchral inscriptions identify women as presbyters, deaconesses, even episcopos, a term that can mean supervisor or bishop. Wealthy women served as patrons, offering their homes as meeting places. In a world where Christianity didn't yet have dedicated buildings, whoever controlled the space had significant power. But as Christianity grew and became institutionalized, something changed. In the 2nd century, we begin to see texts that explicitly restrict female authority. The pastoral epistles, 1 and 2 Timothy, Titus, whose Pauline authorship is questioned by many scholars, contain instructions like, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man." These restrictions reflect the growing influence of Greco-Roman norms. In Roman society, Respectable women were expected to be subordinate to the men of their families. Public roles were the male domain. As Christianity sought respectability in the Roman world, it adapted to these cultural expectations. Women were progressively removed from positions of visible authority, but not all communities accepted these restrictions peacefully. Movements that historians call heretical frequently maintained greater openness to female leadership. Montanists, a 2nd century movement, had prominent prophetesses. Gnostics, as we've already discussed, valued direct spiritual knowledge regardless of gender. Some Gnostic traditions had concepts of divinity that included feminine principles. These communities were progressively marginalized, not just for their theologies, but also for their social practices that challenged emerging gender norms. Mary Magdalene became a focal point of this tension. Texts that presented her as a spiritual leader came from traditions that valued female leadership. Texts that minimized her or characterized her as a repentant sinner came from traditions that restricted female roles. The transformation of Mary Magdalene from apostolic leader to repentant penitent wasn't a historical accident. It was the result of interpretive decisions that reflected and reinforced emerging power structures. Think about the institutional logic. If Mary Magdalene was the first witness of the resurrection, if she received direct commission from Jesus to announce the good news, if she was called apostle to the apostles in some traditions, her authority rivaled that of the 12. But the ecclesiastical structure that consolidated was based on apostolic succession through the 12, especially Peter. Episcopal authority derived from this male line. A prominent Mary Magdalene created a theological and political problem. If she had equal or superior apostolic authority, this would legitimize female leadership. Minimizing her solved this problem. The merger of Mary Magdalene with the sinner from Luke 7 was strategically convenient. It transformed an apostolic leader into an example of passive redemption, a model of silent repentance instead of vocal authority. This transformation was formalized in the 6th century when Pope Gregory the Great explicitly identified Mary Magdalene with the sinner. But it had been happening gradually for centuries. Now connect this to the question of descendants. If Mary Magdalene had children, especially if these children were Jesus's, they would represent an alternative lineage of authority. Not authority based on institutional succession through male structure, but authority based on blood, on direct descent. This would be profoundly threatening to consolidated ecclesiastical authority. It would create alternative legitimacy completely outside institutional control. We're not suggesting conscious and organized conspiracy. We're suggesting that institutional structures have their own logic. They automatically marginalize what threatens their authority, promote what reinforces it. Descendants of Mary Magdalene, if they existed and were known, would be marginalized by this institutional logic, not necessarily out of malice, but out of institutional self-preservation. Communities that resisted the marginalization of the sacred feminine would be natural protectors. Protecting descendants of Mary Magdalene would be an act of resistance against the broader erasure of female leadership. This explains why traditions about descendants survive in marginal communities, not in official structures that had every interest in denying them, but at the margins where alternative memories found refuge. The silencing of Mary Magdalene and the silencing of her possible descendants are part of the same historical process: consolidation of male authority through elimination of female alternatives. When words are dangerous, symbols speak. When texts can be confiscated and burned, stone and paint preserve memories in ways that authorities often don't notice or can't easily erase. Let's explore how communities that guarded traditions about Mary Magdalene may have encoded their beliefs in art and architecture. The iconography of Mary Magdalene in Christian art is fascinating and inconsistent. In some representations, she appears with a book, symbol of teaching and authority. In others, with an ointment jar, reference to the anointing of Jesus. In still others, she's in a cave, reference to traditions of her hermit retreat in France. But there are more subtle elements. In some medieval and Renaissance paintings of the crucifixion, Mary Magdalene is positioned prominently, sometimes closer to Jesus than other disciples, sometimes in colors that visually highlight her. Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper generated intense speculation, especially popularized in recent fiction. The figure to Jesus' right, traditionally identified as John, has characteristics that some interpret as feminine. Could it be Mary Magdalene? Art scholars generally reject this interpretation. John is often represented as young and beardless in Renaissance art. The figure in Leonardo's painting is consistent with these conventions, but the speculation reveals something interesting. People intuitively feel that Mary Magdalene should be present at this crucial moment, even when canonical tradition doesn't place her there. More significant are less obvious symbols. The rose, for example, appears frequently in contexts associated with Mary Magdalene. In medieval Christian symbolism, the rose had multiple layers of meaning: divine love, martyrdom, secrecy. Sub rosa, under the rose, meant confidential. A rose carved in ceilings of meeting rooms indicated that conversations there were secret. There are traditions that associate the rose specifically with Mary Magdalene as a symbol of sacred love. The color red is another recurring element. Mary Magdalene is often painted wearing red, the color of passion, of love, but also of royalty. The red of her mantle could symbolize royal authority as much as emotional devotion. In churches dedicated to Mary Magdalene in southern France, there are intriguing architectural details. Some have unusual orientations, not aligned with typical ecclesiastical construction patterns. Some have proportions that incorporate sacred geometry in ways that scholars still debate. The Basilica of Saint-Maximin-le-Saint-Baume, where relics attributed to Mary Magdalene were venerated, has a crypt with complex symbolism. Sacred art scholars have identified elements that may reference Gnostic or mystical traditions. We need to be careful here. It's easy to see hidden symbols anywhere if we look hard enough. Many popular interpretations of symbolism in religious art are fantastical, not based on serious historical analysis. But it's also true that medieval and Renaissance artists frequently incorporated layers of meaning. Educated patrons expected symbolic depth. Artists had creative freedom to include elements that ecclesiastical authorities might not examine carefully. A verifiable example: in various representations of the crucifixion, there are figures in the background that aren't easily identifiable. Some may be simply generic crowds. Others may represent specific people whose presence isn't documented in the canonical Gospels, but was preserved in local traditions. Pilgrimage sites associated with Mary Magdalene also encode memories. Saint-Baume, the grotto where she supposedly lived, became a site of intense pilgrimage. Why? Officially because it was a place of penance and prayer. But pilgrimages serve multiple functions. They preserve memory of places considered sacred. They create continuity between past and present. They allow traditions to be transmitted orally among pilgrims. A pilgrim visiting Saint-Baume in the 12th century could hear local stories, see symbols in small hermitages, participate in rituals that preserved elements of older traditions. These experiences weren't officially documented. They were lived, remembered, transmitted informally. But they were powerful, precisely because they were experiential and not textual. If communities protected descendants of Mary Magdalene, symbols and sacred places could serve as markers, not obvious announcements, but clues for those who knew how to read. A rose carved in a certain location, an unusual architectural orientation, a painting with details that initiates would recognize. These could be ways of communicating, "Here, this memory is preserved," without dangerous explicit declarations. Before we continue, I want to ask a question that may connect you personally to this millennial story. From where are you watching this video now? Write in the comments your city, your country. Because what we're exploring isn't just ancient and distant history. It's a question about how memories travel through time and space, how traditions cross continents, how stories that began in the Eastern Mediterranean 2,000 years ago still resonate in your life today, wherever you are. Each comment will create a visual map of where these questions matter, where people still seek to understand what was silenced, what was preserved at the margins. Write your location, show that this search is global, and let's continue, because now we need to talk about how these ancient traditions survive in contemporary communities. History doesn't live only in books and museums. It lives in communities that still practice rituals, celebrate festivals, tell stories transmitted by their grandmothers and great-grandmothers. Let's examine how traditions about Mary Magdalene remain alive in some contemporary communities and what these living traditions can teach us about protection and preservation of sacred memories. Each year on May 24th, Thousands of people, many of them of Roma, Gypsy ethnicity, converge on the small village of Sainte-Marie de la Mer in southern France. They come to honor Sarah la Kali, Saint Sarah. This isn't an official Catholic event. Although it happens in a nominally Catholic context, it's a tradition preserved by a community that was historically marginalized, persecuted, massacred, but that maintained its own sacred narratives through all adversities. During the festival, Sarah's statue is carried in procession to the sea. There are chants, prayers, tears. For participants, this isn't an empty ritual. It's a profound connection with ancestry, with identity, with sacred memory of protection. Anthropologists who have studied this phenomenon note how it functions outside official ecclesiastical structures. Local Catholic priests participate, but don't control. The tradition belongs to the community, not to the institution. This is a living example of how memories can be preserved by communities instead of institutions. No one ordered this ritual, no one officialized it. It exists because the community decided it was important to preserve it. If we ask participants why they honor Sarah, answers vary. Some tell stories of Sarah as Mary Magdalene's daughter, others as a servant who accompanied the saints in crossing the sea, still others as a symbol of protection for the marginalized. The diversity of narratives doesn't weaken the tradition, it strengthens it. It shows that different layers of meaning were preserved, that the story was adapted and retold by successive generations, always maintaining a sacred core. In other parts of southern France, there are annual processions and festivals dedicated to Mary Magdalene. Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume holds celebrations that attract pilgrims from all over Europe and beyond. Some come for traditional Catholic devotion. Others seek connection with mystical dimensions of Christianity that they feel are lacking in conventional practices. Still others are simply curious about ancient traditions. What's remarkable is the persistence. These traditions survived the Protestant Reformation, which challenged veneration of saints. They survived the Enlightenment, which ridiculed religious superstitions. They survived modern secularization that emptied many churches. Why? Because they serve functions that go beyond institutional religion. They connect people to places, to stories, to collective identities. There are also contemporary spiritual communities that have adopted Mary Magdalene as a central figure in new ways. Some Christian feminist movements celebrate her as a model of erased female leadership. Some esoteric traditions see her as a spiritual master or initiate in sacred mysteries. These modern interpretations aren't necessarily historical in the academic sense, but they demonstrate the continuing vitality of Mary Magdalene's figure in spiritual imagination. And some of these contemporary communities explicitly preserve traditions about descent, not as proven historical fact, but as sacred narrative that guides their spiritual practice and community identity. We should respect these traditions even when we can't verify them historically. For the communities that practice them, they have real value. They create meaning, build identity, connect the present to the sacred past. Academically, these living traditions teach us about cultural resilience. They show how narratives survive through ritual performance instead of textual documentation. They demonstrate that truth for a religious community doesn't always mean verifiable historical factuality, but rather existential and spiritual meaning. If real descendants of Mary Magdalene existed, contemporary communities that preserve these traditions may be spiritual heirs, if not genetic ones. They guard memory, even when precise details were lost or transformed over centuries. The act of guarding is what matters. Protection didn't end in the 1st or 4th or 12th century. It continues now, each time someone tells the story, participates in the ritual, makes the pilgrimage. In this sense, all who honor Mary Magdalene, whether in official Catholic tradition, whether in marginal rituals, whether in contemporary academic or spiritual exploration, participate in a chain of protection and preservation that crosses millennia. In recent decades, our understanding of early Christianity has changed dramatically. Archaeological discoveries, new methodologies of textual analysis, and more sophisticated historical approaches have revealed an early Christian world much more diverse and complex than we imagined. These academic changes have direct implications for how we understand Mary Magdalene and traditions about her. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 and the Nag Hammadi texts in 1945 transformed biblical studies. For the first time, we had direct access to Jewish and Christian texts from the 1st and 2nd centuries that weren't filtered through later ecclesiastical transmission. These texts revealed extraordinary diversity. Second Temple period Judaism had multiple sects and interpretations. Early Christianity inherited and amplified this diversity. Recent academic research on women in early Christianity has been particularly revealing. Feminist scholars applying rigorous historical methodologies have recovered the roles of women that were minimized or erased in later textual transmission. Analysis of Pauline letters, for example, identifies more women in leadership positions than traditional readings acknowledged. Names that seemed masculine in some translations are feminine in the original Greek. Titles that were translated in a minimizing way for women, helper, but robustly for men, leader, are being revised. Studies on Gnostic communities have shown that they weren't simply heretical or bizarre, but represented genuine alternative Christianities with sophisticated theologies and coherent community practices. Textual analysis of the Gospel of Mary, using modern philological methods, revealed layers of composition that suggest complex development, not simplistic later invention. Archaeology of sites associated with Mary Magdalene in France has produced mixed results. There's no direct archaeological evidence of her presence in the 1st century, but there's evidence of very ancient Christianization of the region and of local cults to Mary Magdalene that predate much of medieval hagiography. DNA analysis of relics attributed to Mary Magdalene hasn't produced conclusive results about identity, but revealed that bones venerated for centuries have dating consistent with antiquity, not being obvious medieval frauds. Comparative studies of oral traditions in different cultures have shown that oral transmission can preserve surprisingly precise historical elements through many generations, especially when traditions are ritualized and considered sacred. This doesn't prove that oral traditions about Mary Magdalene are historically accurate, but suggests we shouldn't automatically dismiss them as later fantasies. Research on social networks in the ancient world, using methods of social and economic history, has mapped how information and people moved throughout the Mediterranean. These studies confirm that routes and networks that could facilitate movement of refugees really existed and were extensively used. Analysis of religious persecutions in other historical contexts provides models of how communities protect individuals and traditions considered sacred under threat. Patterns identified in verified cases can illuminate how protection could have functioned in early Christianity. Interdisciplinary studies combining history, anthropology, sociology of religion, and textual analysis are producing more nuanced understandings of how emerging religious movements negotiate with established powers, how competing narratives compete, how memories are preserved or erased. All these areas of contemporary research don't prove that Mary Magdalene had descendants or that they were protected by secret networks, but they make these narratives more historically plausible than they were when automatically dismissed as impossible or absurd. What changed aren't raw facts. We continue having the same limitations about direct evidence. What changed is our methodological sophistication and our willingness to ask questions that previous generations considered inappropriate. Serious scholars now openly discuss themes that before were academic taboo: diversity of early Christianities, possibility of Jesus having been married, role of women as apostolic leaders, existence of alternative traditions that were violently suppressed. These discussions happen in academic journals, at university conferences, in books published by respectable publishers. They're no longer relegated to sensationalist margins. This represents an awakening of a different kind. Academic and cultural awakening to complexity that was simplified, to voices that were silenced, to stories that were considered too dangerous to tell. This contemporary awakening creates space for questions like ours: who protected Mary Magdalene's children? Not because we have definitive proof that they existed, but because we now recognize that traditions about them deserve serious investigation, not automatic dismissal. Knowledge is evolving. Our understanding is deepening. And in this process, memories preserved at the margins are being brought into mainstream academic conversation. We've gone through historical evidence, preserved traditions, hidden symbols, contemporary communities, but now we need to ask a deeper question. Why does this matter to you watching this video today? The question of who protected Mary Magdalene's children isn't just a historical puzzle. It's a question about spiritual identity, about sacred heritage, about who you are in the great arc of human spiritual history. If the traditions we've explored have a kernel of truth, and we recognize this remains an open question, they suggest something profound. There were ordinary people in humble communities who risked everything to protect something they considered sacred. They weren't emperors or popes. They were fishermen, artisans, merchants, women whose names were never recorded. They were marginalized communities that preserved memories when powerful institutions tried to erase them. This act of protection, whether it happened literally or lives only as symbolic narrative, teaches us something crucial about what it means to be human in the face of power. It means choosing what you protect above your own safety. Think about it. The people who supposedly protected descendants of Mary Magdalene didn't gain earthly power from it. They didn't receive official recognition. They didn't build empires. On the contrary, they risked persecution. They lived in the shadows. They transmitted secrets in whispers. Why? Because they believed that some truths are worth more than personal safety, that some memories need to survive even when all the forces of the world conspire to erase them. You live in a world where this is still true. You live in a time where official narratives still try to control what is remembered and what is forgotten, where institutions still have an interest in determining which stories are told and which are silenced, where marginalized voices still struggle to be heard. The story of Mary Magdalene, whether as literal historical fact or as powerful symbol, is about reclaiming voices that were silenced. It's about questioning who has authority to say what is true. It's about recognizing that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially when there are clear historical reasons for suppression. And more deeply, it's about recognizing the divine within you. One of the recurring themes in Gnostic texts that present Mary Magdalene prominently is the idea of direct internal knowledge, not faith mediated by external authorities, but direct experience of the sacred. The Gospel of Thomas, a text that some scholars associate with traditions that valued Mary Magdalene, contains a saying attributed to Jesus: "The kingdom is within you, and it is outside you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known." This message is of internal spiritual authority, of direct connection with the divine, of not needing intermediaries, is radical. It was radical in the 1st century. It continues to be radical now. Traditions about Mary Magdalene and her descendants, preserved by communities that resisted official orthodoxy, frequently carry this message. We're not saying this is historically accurate, we're saying it's spiritually significant. If you feel resonance with these ideas, you are part of this lineage. Not necessarily genetic lineage, that doesn't matter, but spiritual lineage of people who seek truth beyond official narratives, who value direct knowledge above imposed authority, who protect memories considered dangerous. You are heir to those who protected. Each time you question official narrative, each time you seek to know for yourself instead of passively accepting what you're told. Each time you value marginalized voices that history tried to erase. This isn't about rejecting traditional faith or legitimate religious authority. It's about recognizing that tradition is richer and more complex than any single narrative can capture. It's about honoring sincere seeking wherever it happens. The communities that protected traditions about Mary Magdalene, whether the early Gnostics, the medieval communities of Provence, contemporary Romani traditions, or modern spiritual seekers, all share something: refusal to let certain memories die. You're watching this video because you share this refusal, because something inside you feels there's more to the story than you've been told, because you're willing to ask difficult questions, even when answers are uncertain. This willingness is the legacy. This is the heritage being protected through you. The question isn't whether you can prove genetic descent from Mary Magdalene. The question is whether you recognize the spiritual call to protect truths that others want to silence, to honor voices that were erased, to seek knowledge that was hidden. If you recognize this call, you are part of the unbroken chain of protection that extends over 2 millennia. You are a guardian, not of people or physical documents, but of something more important, of the possibility of multiple truth, of decentralized spiritual authority, of the sacred that cannot be controlled by institutional power. And this, more than any specific historical fact about literal descendants, is what really matters. What was protected through the centuries wasn't just genetics or manuscripts. It was a dangerous and liberating idea that you have direct access to the divine, that your spiritual search is valid, that voices silenced by official history still have something vital to teach us. You carry this heritage now, not because someone gave you official authorization, but because you chose to seek, question, protect memories that deserve to survive. This choice makes you a guardian. This choice makes you an heir. This choice makes you part of the story we're investigating. And this is the final answer to our question. Who protected Mary Magdalene's children? All those who refused to let her memory die. All those who risked to preserve what was considered dangerous. All those who transmitted traditions when doing so was a crime. We've reached the end of an extraordinary journey. We began with an apparently historical question. Who protected Mary Magdalene's children after her death? But along the way, we discovered we were asking much bigger questions. Questions about truth and power, about memory and forgetting, about who decides which stories survive and which are buried. We explored historical evidence with honesty about its limitations. We looked at canonical and apocryphal texts. We traced possible geographical roots. We examined oral traditions preserved by marginalized communities. We analyzed symbols in art and architecture. We investigated how changes in women's roles affected narratives about Mary Magdalene. At each step, we respected the difference between proven historical fact and meaningful tradition. We didn't invent evidence. We didn't claim certainties where there are only possibilities. But we also didn't dismiss traditions just because they can't be verified by conventional historical methods. What did we discover? We discovered that real communities, historically documented, valued Mary Magdalene in ways that differ dramatically from the narrative that became dominant. We discovered that these communities were persecuted, their texts destroyed, their traditions marginalized. We discovered that at the margins of official history, in Romani communities, in Provençal traditions, in Gnostic texts buried in the desert, memories persisted. Memories of Mary Magdalene as leader, as teacher, as central figure whose role was deliberately minimized. We discovered that the question of descendants cannot be definitively proved or refuted with available evidence. But we discovered that traditions about descendants exist, were preserved with extraordinary dedication, and have profound spiritual meaning independent of historical verification. And perhaps most importantly, we discovered that protection wasn't a single event of the distant past. It was a continuous process through centuries. It's happening now, in contemporary communities that keep rituals alive, in scholars who ask questions previously considered inappropriate, in you, watching this video, choosing to seek beyond official narratives. If there were literal children of Mary Magdalene, they were protected by networks of people who valued what they represented, not just genetics, but legacy of teachings, spiritual authority, connection with the divine that didn't need institutional mediation. If there were no literal descendants, the tradition about them still preserves important truth. There were people whose stories were considered too dangerous to survive, and there were other people who risked everything to preserve these stories. In both cases, the act of protection is real. The value of what was protected is real, and your inheritance from this is real. You don't need to believe every detail of the traditions we've explored. You don't need to accept literal descent as historical fact, but we hope you recognize something deeper, that history is always more complex than we've been told, that silenced voices deserve to be heard, that seeking truth is an act of courage. The journey we've made together doesn't have a definitive conclusion, because living history never concludes. Each generation rediscovers, reinterprets, reimagines. New evidence emerges, new questions are asked, new meanings are found. You are part of this continuing journey now, not as a passive spectator, but as an active participant. Your questions matter, your search matters, your willingness to question, investigate, protect memories that deserve to survive. All of this matters. The communities that protected traditions about Mary Magdalene through centuries of persecution did so because they believed certain truths are worth any cost. That some stories need to survive even when all the power in the world tries to erase them. This belief didn't die with them. It lives in you, It lives in all who refuse to accept simplified versions when they know reality is richer. It lives in all who honor marginalized voices. It lives in all who protect the right to seek truth beyond official boundaries. So, who protected Mary Magdalene's children? Ordinary people making extraordinary choices, communities resisting oblivion, traditions surviving at the margins, and now you choosing to continue the search. That's the answer, and it's more powerful than any historical proof could be, because it's not about a dead past, it's about a living present. It's about you, here, now, deciding which memories to protect, which voices to honor, which truths to seek. The chain of protection extends over 2,000 years and reaches you. What will you do with this heritage? If this journey touched something in you, if it awakened questions you didn't even know you had, if it made you see history and spirituality in a new way, then you found your place. This channel exists for people like you, for those who aren't satisfied with superficial answers, for those who honor both sincere faith and honest investigation, for those who recognize that seeking truth is a sacred act, no matter where that search leads them. By subscribing, you join a global community of seekers, people from different traditions, different countries, different journeys, but united by the same thirst, to know more deeply, to question more courageously, to honor memories that deserve to survive. Each video is a new step in this journey. Each investigation opens doors you didn't even know existed. We don't offer easy answers or comfortable certainties. We offer something more valuable, an invitation to seek, question, discover for yourself. Click subscribe, activate the bell, and as you do it, know that you're doing more than following a channel. You're choosing to be a guardian. You're choosing to protect traditions of honest investigation. You're choosing to honor those who, over millennia, risked everything to preserve truths that others wanted to erase. And when you finish subscribing, there's another video waiting for you. Click on it. Continue the journey, because what we explored today is just the beginning. There's much more to discover, much more to question, much more to understand. Your search doesn't end here. In fact, it has barely begun. Go ahead, click on the next video, and let's go together deeper into this extraordinary investigation of forgotten memories, silenced voices, and truths that refuse to die. The chain of protection continues, through you, starting now. Thank you for watching until the end. Until the next video.